Welcome to Syntax. Today, we're going to be talking all about Vue.js with CJ. That's right,
Hello.
Wes had a baby and he is out for a little bit, so CJ is going to be joining us. And what better to talk about than something that Wes and I have not been able to bring to the show, which is Vue.js. So I'm really stoked. CJ just got back from VueConf. He's going to be telling us all about why he thinks you should be paying attention to Vue. And I'm going to be asking him some dumb guy questions about what is what here in the modern Vue landscape. My name is Scott Tolinsky. I'm a developer from Denver. With me today is CJ Reynolds, aka Coding Garden. We're going to be really getting into some Vue stuff. But before we do that, you're going to want to check out Sentry at sentry.io, the perfect place to really understand exactly what's happening in your application at any given point. The best thing about Sentry is that I've used it for a really long time and thrown it on side projects, thrown it on main projects, all that stuff. And anytime that I have people using my applications, it just helps me get to the bottom of where there could potentially be issues. So that way I can solve them before my users tell me that there's a problem. Because if your users telling you there's a problem, that means 20 billion other of your users, if you have that many, have already had that problem and just did not tell you. The one who steps up to tell you isn't the first or only person who's had that problem, and you don't want that to happen. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax, sign up and get 2 months for free. CJ, what's up, my man?
Hello. Not much. Excited to talk about Vue. It's one of my favorite things that I don't get to use that often or talk about as often. So I'm super excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. We've talked about this a little bit before. We had a little bit of Vue talk in a potluck that we recorded, and you know what? I've fallen out of the Vue landscape a bit. So I have Vue experience here,
Sure.
and not enough modern Vue experience, but enough to know what's what here. I think the main thing we want to know, CJ, throughout this whole episode is why should anybody be paying attention to Vue when there's so many other great options out there? So let's get into it. Let's explain us about Vue.js.
Sure. And I guess I'll start with what it is for anybody that's completely new to all of this, but it is a front-end framework, just like React or Svelte or Angular. You can use it to build front-end websites, and it's been around for a long time. It's been around almost as long as React,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
many people may not know. It definitely has gone under the radar a lot, but I started using it back in 2016, and back then I even gave a talk, an overview of Vue.js. I gave that at a few different meetups and conferences. So yeah, I've been using it a long time. And it is a front-end framework, and it has evolved over the years. So they call themselves the progressive JavaScript framework. So one of the things about them that is pretty cool compared to even like React or Svelte is you can use it with just a script tag if you really want to. So you can actually just add it to your site and then get some of the features of creating components and having templates and things like that without even needing a build process or anything like that. I mean, these days, you probably are going to have a build process. You're going to have a more complex site. It's going to have routes and multiple pages. And so they have an offering for that too. They have the CLI, which is also very full featured compared to the CLIs of a lot of these other front-end frameworks. But yeah, they build themselves as incrementally adoptable and progressive. They're approachable, performant, versatile. And one of the things first that I like about them is if you know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you're going to have a very easy time picking up Vue.js because their template syntax is very much HTML. But then there's a few things sprinkled on top, like directives and then some handlebars. But for a lot of people, especially people that have been using React for a long time, you forget how weird JSX is. And I have some gripes and complaints about just working in complex React code bases with complex JSX. And I've never had that experience in Vue.
Yeah, that's really great. You know what? I'm gonna refrain from saying the word svelte too much on this show because I want this to be about Vue, but I think that is one of the things that turned me on to first Vue and then onto Svelte is that React does feel like you're shoehorning in HTML into JavaScript, where Vue and Svelte definitely kind of take more of the historical like templating language flow of you're working with HTML first and then enhancing HTML, which has always resonated with me because I got my start as just doing HTML and CSS, given that that was, what I did mostly CMS work and stuff like that, your PHP, but your primary core of writing things is in HTML. And I personally like that more than my primary way of doing things is writing JS. I don't know if you have any experience with Backbone. Did you ever use Backbone?
A long time ago, but yeah.
Yeah, Backbone to me the first time I used Backbone, I was like, why are we doing this in JavaScript? This feels like this something we should be doing in HTML. So I like that little background you gave for us here.
Definitely. And I guess I can start to talk about some of the things that Vue has and why I like it. I guess first I'll even start with how to get started. So like I said, you could have just an HTML page. You could add the Vue script tag from a CDN. And then if you check out their docs, there is a built-in function called create app. You create yourself an app, return an object that has some data on it that you want to use in your Vue, and then you just reference it in the Vue. And so you can do just that. They also have a CLI though. And so if you do, let me grab the CLI command for you. Yeah, npm create Vue at latest. That'll run the CLI. And if you're watching the video podcast, I have just an example of this on the screen here. But this is one of the things that I like about Vue as well is I guess the Svelte CLI does this now, or the Svelte Kit CLI does this. But there was a long time where like for React, create React app literally just spits out a React app and there's nothing more customizable beyond that. And I think even the early days of Svelte was the same way, but Vue has had a CLI for a very long time, and it customizes the app that it generates. So it'll ask you, do you want TypeScript or not? Do you want to support JSX, which I'll show an example of because it's pretty interesting that you technically can use JSX with Vue if you really want to. They have a built-in router. So this is something I'll talk about as well. There are libraries in the Vue ecosystem that just everyone uses, right? There's not a debate about which one is better, which one should you use. If you're going to do routing in Vue, you just use Vue Router. The CLI will ask you to use that. Same thing for state management. In the world of React, there is Redux, Jotai, Immer,
Zoostand.
All of the Zoostand. Yeah.
Valito, whatever that is. Do you think, and sorry to interrupt here, do you think that Vue.js has less confusion over what to use because the CLI is opinionated, or do you think that is why it became less, or do you think they just latched onto certain projects and they became the options?
Well, I think it was the inverse, and the thing is, these libraries are from the core team. So Pinia is from the core team that works on. It's not built into Vue.js, but it is a separate library that you install. But people from the core Vue.js team are also working on Pinia, which is their state management. And same thing, people from the core team are working on Vue Router. So
gotcha.
All of these kind of like existed, and then like the CLI kind of just pulls them all together. But for as long as I can remember, like even back in 2016, these were the choices. Well, back in 2016, it wasn't Pinia for state management. It was Vuex, which was like their equivalent to Redux. But they got a newer one. More people are adopting that in their newer code bases. But yeah, I think kind of the libraries emerged out of the core team, and then that's just the thing that people use. And so with that, when you come across a Vue.js app, there's not a lot of guesswork involved. Like, they're going to be using Vue Router, they're going to be using Pinia or Vuex. Whereas with the React app, it's up in the air. Like, everyone I come across is like completely different. You have the opinions of every team embedded in the code base itself, which, has some pros, right? Because we are developers and individualists, and we like to have our opinions and like what we use. But it is kind of refreshing to be able to jump into a code base and be productive a little more sooner, because you don't have to figure out what stack have they chosen for this React app.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the big reasons why Next.js rose to prominence, is because, granted, besides the fact that it's a full stack app, but React has always been so unopinionated on these things. Like when an opinionated stack of these things becomes the way, the default, or the way to do things, I personally prefer that myself. I want my framework to do more for me. I want my framework to have those options available that are coming from the maintainers. The user land is great, and having freedom in user land is great, but somebody makes a package, it becomes popular, they stop maintaining it. Next thing you know, you're migrating and migrating and migrating. And not only that, you got churn inside of internal APIs in React. I think the one hangover I have from working in React for so long was migrating and churning constantly.
Yeah. And another thing that I really like that comes built in with the CLI is generating an ESLint config and prettier config by default. These days, you're probably used to it, especially if you're using Vite, because even if you're using like Vite with a React app, it's going to generate, I think it might ask you, but it'll generate an ESLint config and a prettier config. But before that, I used to spend hours just trying to get my specific ESLint config and prettier all working nicely together in a React app. Like I even have a video from like 2 or 3 years ago on the Coding Garden channel where it's an hour and a half, and it's literally me just setting up a React project. I'm not adding any features. I'm just like configuring the router and configuring Redux, and then configuring ESLint and prettier. But it is nice that aspect of the CLI tool and the Vue world kind of leaked out into other things, especially because things are using Vite now, which originated in the Vue.js ecosystem. And now it gives you like an ESLint and a prettier config. You're just ready to go. You don't have to spend so much time configuring it.
Yeah, no thanks, right?
Yeah. So let's kind of get into like why I like it over specifically React. I'm going to use React as an example because most people, I mean, a lot of people know and use React. So that's probably like the point of reference that they'll go from. But one of the major things is less boilerplate. So when you're working in a React app, and let's say you're hooking up a form, hooking up forms is so much of what we do as web developers. The canonical way to do this in React is to add a change listener to the input, set up some sort of state, and then when a change is detected, you update that state. Now, you could say these days, maybe you might use form data instead, or maybe you're using a library that makes it a little bit easier. But if you look in, I think even in the React docs, they show you this is how you hook up forms. And it's a lot of code. And I mean, the amount of inputs that you have to hook up and wire all of this up to is a ton. And in Vue.js, there's a single directive. It's called vmodel. You say vmodel, you specify the state variable that you want to bind that input to. That's all you need. It stays up to date under the hood. And if you're familiar with Svelte, they have a very similar thing. I believe it's like bind this on an input. And then you specify the variable name.
It's bind value, by the way.
Bind value, there you go.
Yeah.
That's nice because you don't have a bunch of like functions hanging around and like extra stuff to do some of the most basic things. I have some examples I'll show for the video pod, but also kind of describe what's happening here. This example here is from an app that's just implementing autocomplete. One of the things I did over on the Coding Garden channel was I implemented autocomplete and 8 different front-end frameworks. And so that's all of the things like, first of all, binding the input, which is what we're talking about right now. But also like making an API request and then potentially canceling that API request if a user has typed more, debouncing input, all of these things that you want to do in front end. I have a repo here that does it with a bunch of front end frameworks. And so what I'm showing right now is the vmodel in our Vue app here. So I have an input v-model, and then I specify the state variable name that I want to bind to. And then if you look in the script itself, I have a variable here, it's const filter, and then I'm using ref to define this state variable. So ref inside of Vue is not like ref inside of React, which is typically for like element references. A ref is just like a single little state variable that you want to keep track of changes to. So I have a filter, it's a ref, starts off as an empty string, and then I just bind that with vmodel. Syntax, super simple. If you take a look at how we do this with React, we have an input, we have an onChange handler, we pass in an arrow function that gets access to the event. We then are calling our setFilter state function, passing in e.target.value, and then after that, we're binding value to be filter, which is our state variable. And if you look at the top of the component, our state variable is from use state. So I have const filter, set filter, and that's use state for the empty string. So even the simplest thing, just like simple little state management, keeping track of that on an input is just so much less boilerplate in Vue. It's just vmodel. That's all you need.
Yeah. I think that is something with React specifically, and you'll know this too because you did Angular before React. Any of us who came from something like Angular before React, when we saw the React means of working with form state in React, I think my first impression of it is, surely you must be kidding. I have to write a function. Like my form has state itself. Like I shouldn't have to automatically then hand move that into a variable. And while having that control can be really great, sometimes if you want that control, I would argue most forms don't need that level of control. You're typically reading the value, and then you can utilize that value inside of your control flow or if statements if you want, like dynamically stepped forms and stuff like that. But to actually have to take the value individual value and set it into state always felt weird to me if you're not doing things like manipulating the text string as a user's typing, right? Oh, I'm going to make this so it only can be lowercase and it's automatically lowercasing their text as they're typing or something like that. So yeah, that's a big move in simplicity is the right call there, I think.
Definitely. And then there are also these just other little niceties that you get used to in React, but you forget about. So one thing is self-closing tags. So I teach a lot of beginners, and that's one of the things when I'm teaching them React, they just get so hung up on is just you need that self-closing tag on like an input or an image. With Vue, your template is technically in my code example here, if I have a self-closing input, but I think that's just because I write so much React code. You actually don't need the self-closing tag on things in your Vue app because it is just HTML, and HTML by design is actually like very forgiving. Like some things don't even need a closing tag. Like I think an image tag in the HTML spec that technically does not have a closing tag, but you still need it in the React world. So that's a little nicety.
Yeah. Hold on. Even to jump in there real quick. Did you see Rich Harris had a big post about how Svelte is parsing HTML self-closing tags incorrectly because everybody kind of parses them incorrectly?
I didn't
I'll
see
have to send
that,
this to you. It's really good. I'll post it in the show notes. There's some really interesting self-closing HTML tags about how most people have generally their mental model for how self-closing tags works is completely wrong. And as somebody who had never heard of this before, I kind of was shocked at how this worked. So I'll post it in the show notes. I'll give it a look for yourselves.
Yeah. But I think to that note, like React has become so prevalent, people kind of forget how much it changed in terms of like how we do things. And this is one of those things where like, well, yeah, now everything's just self-closing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's a Reactism. It's not a web thing. Yeah.
Exactly. There's some other niceties here. I feel like I'm not giving a super basic introduction. We're kind of jumping around in these code examples, but another little nicety I'll show here, and maybe that's the theme of this, is just the little niceties, things you do so often that you forget about. But in Vue, when you want to add a event handler to an element, you can use the shorthand @ and then the event name. So in my code example here, I'm adding a submit handler to a form. So I'm saying @submit. And then if you look at the React example, it's on submit, and then you specify the callback. But one of the things you do pretty often in front-end React code, I guess things are changing now that we have like actions and server-side codes and stuff, is you typically prevent the default action on a form submission because you want to handle things with JavaScript. And in Vue, you just say event name .prevent. That automatically prevents the default action. This is something we do so often, and it's beautiful that it's kind of just built in there. There's a few other little helpers that you can just do dot on, and then you don't have to call them explicitly. So in the React code example, I get access to the event and have to explicitly call event.prevent default. So that's another thing that nice and built in. In terms of like conditional rendering. So let's say you want to show something on the page. In this case, we want to show a progress bar on the page if loading is true. In Vue, there's a directive called vif, and then you pass in a variable. If that variable is true, that element will render out. If it's false, it won't. And in React, there's nothing built in. We just use either, I don't even know what this is. You know what this is called, where you have like variable and something? I don't even know a name for it.
Yeah, when you use the double ampersand in the templating syntax, I don't know if there is a name for it. It's just like, it's just exploiting conditionals in JavaScript is really what it is. But yeah, I know that's always bugged me about React because it's not super readable if you don't know what it is. Sure, once you learn what it is what it is and you got it. But if you were new to React, you'd look at that and be like, why are they doing it that way? If statement to me is always read much cleaner. Do you maybe want to take a second on the word directive and maybe explain what that is?
The way that you use them is just as attributes on your elements. So in this case, we have a progress element, and then you see a little attribute there, v-if equals double quotes, and then the value inside of it. So we call them directives. They really just are like special attributes that do something specific inside of Vue. And so earlier, that v-model one, that's also a directive. There's a directive v-show, which will set display none on an element instead of actually removing it like vif would. So vif literally removes it from the DOM, versus vshow adds and removes display none. And then there's also v4. So when you're iterating over lists of elements, you have v4 and you say v4 element in elements, or like the list name. They're just attributes, but they're kind of like domain specific attributes to when you're working in Vue.js.
Did you know that the word directive was first used in Angular? I didn't know that. I figured it came from something else before that.
It was my first exposure to it, so yeah.
Same. I just figured it existed before that.
Yeah, I think the early days, a lot of the terminology was actually stolen from Angular 1 or borrowed from Angular 1.
Yeah.
Like even like when I first started learning Vue.js, it was very soon after like having used Angular 1 a lot. And so vif is ngIf in Angular, and v4 is ng. Is it ng4 in Angular?
Yeah, I think it is, or was.
Yeah, or and then ng model is it in Angular. I think it's sort of similar these days in more modern Angular, but it's like some of the stuff has changed a little bit. But yeah, a lot of this stuff was borrowed from the early days of Angular.
Yeah, wild stuff, yeah.
So another thing I really like about Vue is its built-in way of handling styles. So first of all, I haven't talked about this yet, but Vue has this concept of SFC, or single file components. So everything related to a component is in that same file. And so in an SFC, you will have a template. So that's where all of your HTML goes. You'll have a script. That's where all of your TypeScript goes. And then you'll also have a style tag, all of which are optional, depending on whether or not you need those things in a component. But a typical SFC will have a template, a script, and a style. But one of the really nice things about this is this idea of scoped styles. So if you just put the attribute scoped on your style tag, now these styles will only apply to this component. And this has been built into Vue.js as long as I've been using it, which is crazy because when you get into the world of React, there's so many style solutions just to solve this one problem, right? Like I want to style a component, but I don't want to style everything else. So you have things like styled components, CSS in JS, CSS modules, which isn't React specific, but it is one way to do it as well.
And I will die on this this weird little hill that Tailwind is a strategy for scoping CSS. People find that point to be odd, but I will die on that hill that Tailwind exists within popularity in React world because it is solving scoping in addition to default styles, whatever. But scoping is a big reason why people end up using it.
Yeah, it is. I guess we don't want to get into that debate. It comes with the downsides of like duplication and whatever else. But yeah, like if you're going to be putting styles everywhere you need them, they're going to be scoped to exactly where you use them. So
exactly.
Yeah. So that's one of the cool things. It's just built in. You don't have to install another library. Svelte definitely took inspiration here. So because by default, a style tag in Svelte is scoped. Whereas in Vue, you have to opt in. There's an attribute called scoped that you specifically put on your style tag to make it scoped. Otherwise, they're global by default. And then the other thing is actually just like working with and binding styles. So I'm going to pull up in the Vue docs really quick. There's section on working with class and style bindings. So in the world of React, because it's just JavaScript, and I'm air quoting for all the people listening at home, it's just JavaScript. If you want to conditionally bind like a CSS class name, you could use like a ternary, right? You would just like embed a ternary there and say, if this state value is true, then yes, apply this CSS class name. But because we do that so often, there are libraries that have popped up in the React ecosystem, like I think it's called CLSX, or there's another library called just class names. And so basically, when you're working with conditionally applying classes in React, you have to bring that library in, and then it makes it a little bit nicer for adding and removing classes conditionally if you need to. This is just built into Vue.js, and it has been since as long as I've used it. So if you want to bind a specific class name, you do :class equals, you then do object syntax, and then every key of the object is the class name that you want to apply. And the value is an expression. If it resolves to true, that class will be applied. And so in this example, we have an object with the class active, and colon, and then the expression is active. So is active would be some state variable. And if is active is true, that class gets applied. But this is really nice because if you have like 5 or 6 different conditional classes that are all dependent on various conditional states, the syntax is pretty cool because it's just like an object specifying class names. versus having to pull in another library or having like a bunch of like nested ternaries and stuff like that.
Sick. Yeah, I love that. And for those of you wondering why you might want your styles scoped, I know we did cover a little bit of that, but when you scope your styles to a component, it makes it really easy to prevent writing styles in one place that then are affecting something in a completely unexpected place of your application. Like for instance, you apply an H1 element, you give it a color of red inside of a component CSS somewhere. Next thing you know, all of your H1s on your site are red, and you have no idea where that is, so you have to do command find. If you scope your CSS to that component, then only the H1 inside of that component will be getting that color. And I really prefer hard scoping, so I tend to, even when I wrote Vue, I tended to scope everything hard to the component instead of trying to work globally a little bit more. I think personally, it puts you into that more component-based mindset.
Definitely. And I guess I will add specifically this class attribute for binding class names. That technically doesn't have to be scoped. It kind of like works outside of the scoping system, but it is a way of conditionally applying classes as well.
Sick. Okay, so CSS sounds great. I love all that stuff. And it is funny how much my head nods because I like all of this stuff from Svelte as well. The Vue approach is just a little bit different, right? But let's talk about state management. What's built in? What does it do? What do you have to bring? Do you ever have to go to userland for anything in state management?
You typically don't. It's typically all built in. And I guess let's give a quick history lesson of working in with state inside of Vue. So if you're watching on the video pod, I'm in the Vue.js tutorial, and they have these really cool little toggles where you can toggle between the different kinds of ways of defining a component. But it used to be that your component would have a data property associated with it, a data method, and that data method returns an object, and any properties on that object are your state, and then you can access any of those things inside of your template. So this is kind of like the options API, or like the older way of doing this. One of the nice things about Vue is they have maintained compatibility with the older API. So even though this isn't the like modern way of doing things, you can still use the options API. Cool. But then they introduced the composition API. And so this is a little bit closer to like hooks in React. And so instead of having that data method, you now have these little functions where you can use to then define your state values. And so we talked about them earlier, but one of them is ref. So if I want in this example, a string property called title class, I'll use the ref function, pass in a string, that'll be the default value, and then I can reference that inside of my template by name. And so that's how you define variables. You're using ref. There's also something built in called reactive. Reactive allows you to do this for an object. So maybe you have an object with 4 or 5 or 6 different properties. Let's say like you're implementing a form and you want to keep track of the values of all the inputs on that form. You probably have 5 or 6 of those. You might create a state variable called form and use reactive, and then you can pass in an object with all of the properties of the default values of that form. So that's how you define it. It's pretty straightforward. But one of the things I really like about it is that it is mutable. We do not have to jump through hoops to update our values. We don't have to call a special method like set state. We can literally just reassign a value and the Vue automatically updates. I'll show an example in the autocomplete UI example that I was talking about earlier. So for instance, we have a loading variable. So in Vue, I'm saying const loading equals ref, and then I'm passing in false. So that loading variable starts off as false. And then later on, whenever the function is called that needs to update that variable, we just say loading.value equals false. We don't have to call set state or anything like that. Under the hood, Vue.js is using proxies, so it can basically know exactly when you are setting values here, and then update the view accordingly. If you compare that to like React, we have our classic little use state hook here. So we say use state, pass in the default value of false. That gives us back the variable loading, but it also gives us a function set loading that we call in order to update it. And then if we ever need to set that set that variable, we have to call the set loading variable. And so this is a very basic example, right? It's just a Boolean. But where this really shines is in like deeply nested complex data. So have you ever had like a a Redux store or any other like deep store in a React app that has like an array, and then that array has objects inside of it, and then those objects have properties that are objects themselves. If you ever need to update one of those deeply nested properties, you have to do so much just to do it in an immutable way, right? You have to map the array, and then you potentially have to spread each nested object. And then if you're doing a nested object, you have to spread that as well. So I don't have an example to show you right now, but things can get really, really hairy when you're dealing with deeply complex and nested state. But in Vue, you don't have to deal with that because you literally just update the property and the Vue automatically updates. There's no need to do immutable state updates.
Yeah, if you're looking at the video pod and you're seeing these ref functions and stuff like that, you may say, "Hey, this looks exactly like how Svelte is doing runes." In fact, the new runes for Svelte, I think, borrows a lot from Vue.js in a very positive way. And I think that would kind of rub some people the wrong way at first within the Svelte world, just because, all right, now you gotta use a function to create state rather than just creating a variable. But honestly, I think the benefits like you're talking about with this fine-grained reactivity and unifying how state is done is such it's a really power move from Vue from the start. I really do appreciate the approach to state there. Anybody who's ever written Redux probably was like, why do I have to call a thing that calls a thing that updates a thing that spreads a thing? Like, there's 8 steps to do a thing, and Redux was fine, but most of the time you don't need to jump through 8 hoops and create a new object full of data. You just want to update one single thing and have the application respond, right?
Definitely. And in the world of React, you typically, if you're doing this at scale, you would probably reach for a library like Immer or Immutable.js, because they do make it nicer to update things without having to like spread and map. I think is it Zustand that kind of has that built in, or I think you can. It has like a
Zustand
plugin
does.
for Immer. But again, you have to reach for another library. In this case, it's just built in. So every app you come across is going to be doing it in the same way.
Yeah, I do appreciate that for sure.
And then the last piece on state management is this idea of global state management. So we talked about it earlier, but in the world of React, you typically are reaching for like Redux or Zustand or Jotai. All of these libraries basically allow you to have state that can be easily pulled into components at different levels within your application. The beautiful thing about the composition API here in Vue is that it's not restricted to a component. So without even using Pina, which I'll talk about as their global state management, you could literally define a module that declares a few of these ref variables and then just import it into any component and it will just work. There's no weird issues about like, well, did you call it in the right way or where does it get instantiated? You literally can just create these refs, import them into other components, and it will just work. And so I didn't talk about this earlier, but that's another nice thing about the composition API in Vue is like it doesn't have all of these rules of hooks like when working in React, right? Like with React, you can't have conditional use effects. And also, I guess I didn't talk about this, but you have to manually specify your dependency array for like use effects and use memo and use callback. In Vue, all of that's built in. So in Vue, they have a composition function called computed, and this is how you would get like use memo, but you don't have to pass in the dependencies. It can auto track those dependencies. They also have a function called watch, so you can specify which of these reactive variables you want to watch, and that callback will get called. And yeah, it's just nice. A lot of this stuff is built in. You don't have to like manually do all of that, manually do the tracking. And those same functions that I mentioned, like computed and watch and anything else built into the composition API, all of those can be used outside of a component, defined to do the things the way you want, and then just import it into any other component.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, all this stuff will make your head spin a bit with React when you really start diving in there, right? When you really start getting into complex state management, or just in general with React, having to think about when is this function running? How many times is this function running? Which things I actually have to reach for to make sure this function doesn't run too many times and cause my application to slow down. It is just nice to have that fine-grained reactivity right there in the app.
Definitely. And beyond that, for global state management, there's this library called Pina. Basically, we're using those things that I talked about that are built into Vue.js. We're using ref, we're using computed, so we can define all of our computed values, all of our state values, do whatever we need to do, also define methods that operate on those values, and then just return the things that we need elsewhere in the app. I would argue that this is much closer to just JavaScript than the kind of things you have to do like in React. Like these are just a few methods you call. You literally return an object. There's nothing special about how to use the return value here or whatever else. So yeah.
Yeah, this is the Wes is away so we can hate on React episode. Oh yeah, man! I'd never seen Pina before. This was in my time of using Vue. I don't think this was really widely used or a thing. So it's interesting. I didn't know this existed. So cool project. That's one thing that the Vue ecosystem has that the Svelte ecosystem doesn't have in the same way. And I'm not necessarily putting Svelte down for this, but like the React ecosystem, what does it have? It has a lot of mature libraries and a lot of users. And the one thing that the Vue ecosystem also has, a lot of mature libraries and a lot of users, people building actual stuff.
Definitely. So I would say, like, if I'm trying to convince you to like use Vue over Svelte, that might be one point, right? It has been around for a long time. That there's a lot of maturity in the libraries that are out there. At the same time, I mean, I do have to go to bat for Svelte as well. Like a lot of times you can just use the JavaScript version of a library. You don't need like Svelte specific things, which is nice. But for certain aspects, like maybe even like a mapping library or some of these other things that you do pretty often, there very likely is an existing library that is battle tested, been running in production for a while because it's been around for so long.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about styles, we talked about state, we've talked about templating, all the things that you're doing when you're building your stuff. But what about application building, right? Next.js, whether you like it or you don't like it, it is mature. SvelteKit, really great. Astro, really great. What's the full stack application platform for Next.js, and how does it stack up?
Yeah, so the Next.js equivalent in the Vue world is a thing called Nuxt, and it's very similar. They have file-based routing, they have API routes, but in my opinion, it kind of like goes above and beyond what even like Nuxt.js does. Next Nuxt. It goes beyond what Next.js does. And I mean, you mentioned that Next.js is, I guess, mature, but like the app router is pretty new, and like I've tried to build some more complex things with like app router and like actions, and it still feels like half baked. It still feels like they're trying to figure things out.
Sorry, you can go back in the archives of Syntax, and within the first 10 episodes, I'm talking about how Next.js is not for me, and I don't know if it's gotten any closer to being for me. Not to put it down because it's a great piece of software, but it's not for me. It never has been. It's nice to hear that Nuxt just isn't a straight up clone of Next.js or something.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that Nuxt did first that like even SvelteKit have learned from and like Next.js have learned from. Though these days it kind of feels like Next.js and SvelteKit are kind of like converging to like very similar solutions. But one of the things I like about Nuxt, which some people initially kind of hate, is this idea of auto imports. Because like you can have a components folder, define some reusable components in there, and then just use those components in your pages and in your other components. They are auto imported. And then there's a lot of
hate
other.
That?
No, I like it.
Okay, I like that as well. Okay.
Yeah, it's less boilerplate. I mean, like the thing is, when you look at like a Next.js app or a React app, I guess it's nice that you can look at the imports at the top and see everything that is being used. But when you're working in a large application, you're going to have 10 or 15, maybe 20 different imports. And so that's a lot to manage, especially if you think about, okay, there are two different components that are slightly similar, but they all depend on those same imports. Now you have these imports all over the place. So in a larger code base, I like the idea of auto imports.
You know what? I do too. And I used to, I did it on Syntax because I thought Wes would kill me if I did this. But on Level Up tutorials, I made gratuitous use of them. And I did so using SvelteKit-auto import is the comparable package. Okay. Yeah, it works great. I used it quite frequently and really enjoy that. So if you're interested in that technique, it's nice.
Nice. But yeah, the way Nuxt works is like it's just built on top of Vue, so it works on the idea of single file components, but it uses file-based routing. So For any page that you want, instead of having to use like the Vue router library, you just define these pages as separate files, and then they'll be routed to according to their name. And then the other nice thing built into it is like these, the way that you're able to create API functions or like server-side codes. And I haven't played around with it recently, but I was playing around with it when they initially came out with Nuxt 3. And they had already thought about this idea of full stack type safety and being able to write fetch code once that works both on the client and the server and pulls in all of the types. So like you could define an API route in like the API folder, and it's going to be like just your standard server-side request handler, and you can do database stuff or whatever else you want. And then in the component, when you use fetch, if that code is running on the server side, it's not going to make an API request. It's running within the same code base, so it can actually just directly invoke that API function. And then if that code is running on the client, it will actually make a fetch request. But I think SvelteKit is doing this now. They were one of the first to do it, and because of that, you get full stack type safety. So whatever gets returned from that API function, that type is exported and usable on the other side whenever you're calling it with fetch.
Yeah, I love that. Love that full stack type safety. And that's such a huge win, right? Yeah. Remember,
Definitely.
we used to have to do API calls via use effect. You're hitting a fetch, and then you get your thing back, and then you got to just pray and hope that data comes in with the right types. You just assign it to the type and maybe cast it or something like that. And yeah, I know. I love it when you can just have your data available in the component, automatically know that the types are going to be accurate to what you're expecting.
Definitely.
I'm interested in the future of Vue because we're seeing a convergence on the idea of compilers for our front end frameworks. I think Svelte and Solid.js really proved that the compiler is a good idea for many ways in your application. It can do a lot of powerful things for your front end code. And now React has introduced a compiler, and React folks are getting their eyes opened to why that's so great. What's the Vue story there? Because I have heard that there is a Vue compiler, but I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Well, first I'll start with they have had a compiler-esque code for a long time, even before. So the thing that you're talking about is Vue Vapor. That's their new way of having your same Vue component, but then compiling it into codes that doesn't require a virtual DOM.
Cool.
But the Vue build process itself has actually had an optimizer built in for a very long time, where if you're doing certain things that maybe like you didn't, maybe you have a variable that never changes and you're rendering that in your template, it was smart enough to remove it as even like a variable reference and just like embed it right in. And then there are other types of optimizations that it could make. So Vue itself has had like optimizations and like compiler-esque things for like a very long time. But the idea of purely stripping away the entire runtime and virtual DOM and everything else, that's definitely a newer thing. And Vue Vapor is the idea there. And so it's still in research mode. They're working on it, and they want to have first class support for it and make it opt-in. So eventually you'll have this Vapor attribute that you can just add to your component. And once you add that on there, it's going to get all of those optimizations and basically just get compiled into native JavaScript code. It won't need a virtual DOM anymore or any sort of Vue runtime to be able to run those components.
Okay, cool. So that is something that we didn't mention that I think it is good to be explicit. So without this, Vue does run on the virtual DOM and not the actual DOM. And with this, it becomes virtual DOM less.
That is correct. Yes.
Cool. I know the virtual DOM is a cool idea, and I know it was made for reasons, but I gotta say, as a web developer, I'm not using my web tech to do I'm not building, command line CLIs or whatever with React like some people are doing. I'm not using the front end framework to build things other than websites, web apps, desktop apps with a web view, those types of things. The concept of a virtual DOM never made a ton of sense to me. It always felt like it was stepping in the way. But I do get that it exists for reasons, as a higher level. It makes it work without having to necessarily be explicitly attached to the DOM. And I get that. So I love to hear there's a virtual DOM-less world here.
Definitely.
Okay, so all of this sounds great. Vue is great. I've been a long time big fan of Vue, but many people out there, are still stuck in the world of, sure, but are people using it? Yes, Vue sounds great. Yes, it's easier. Yes, it will make my life less annoying when I'm working in my code. But are people actually using it? So, CJ, are people using Vue.js?
They are. Yeah, they absolutely are. And I guess one indicator you might look at is like GitHub stars. And it's not the best indicator. It's kind of just a little bookmark, that people are interested in this thing. But the original Vue.js library has 207,000 stars on GitHub. And then recently with version 3, they forked, or they didn't fork, they have a new code base called Core. And that code base has 45,000 stars. But if you want to look at actual usage, the Vue library on NPM gets 4.7 million weekly downloads, and to me that's huge. That means people are using it. Like people are installing this and using it. It doesn't get as much coverage and as much hype as like Svelte and Vue does on X or Twitter or whatever. But people are using it and they're building real stuff with it. And I guess also if you want to talk about the community, they have a really big Discord. Yeah, so there are 123,000 members of the Vue.js Discord, and it's very active. If you ever have like Vue.js questions, you can go in there, ask. They're happy to help. That they use the same Discord, I believe, for like Pina and Vue Router. Maybe Pina has a separate one, but ultimately everybody's hanging out there in that Discord if you want to get help. But yes, people are using it. It's a very big community. It's just not as loud as maybe some of the other things that we're used to.
Yeah, it's not wild how that happens. I wonder like why that is with how we end up in bubbles like this, or everyone talks about React, but yeah, people are building great stuff with Vue, and I think this conversation has really come to a head lately with the whole Laravel discussion that's been happening somewhat recently on Twitter, where yeah, people are building things with Laravel. They're building things with Vue. And sometimes it does feel like people are just talking about React. Not that people aren't building things with React, but it does, there's a weird thing where there isn't as much dialogue, but there is quite a bit, if just an absolute amount of people like really being productive with this framework. So yeah, people are using it for sure.
And I guess the one thing to add, which I didn't mention, but you brought up Laravel. Laravel actually adopted Vue as their front-end framework of choice. So Laravel is typically a PHP back-end framework, but a few years ago, they made it so that if you ever need to do any sort of like client-side JS, you actually do it with Vue.js. So it's a very cool, interesting relationship there. Like Laravel's getting more press, but it is actually using Vue. So if more people use Laravel, they're potentially also going to be using Vue as well.
Sick. Yeah, that's great. Laravel's one of those things we're going to have to spend some serious time on this show very soon. Cool. Mm-hmm. Well, that's it for Vue. If you want to learn more about the history of Vue, you can watch the Vue Honeypot documentary that came out a couple years ago, starring yours truly. I am in the documentary and saying nice things about Vue, but it's really well made. Honeypot makes the best documentaries. They do great stuff there and gives you quite a bit of history on Evan's approach to creating Vue and thinking about Vue and the community involvement. So highly recommend that if you haven't seen that and you're interested in learning more about Vue in general. And if you want to hear, we did an episode a long time ago, Scott Teaches Wes Vue. If you want to hear us talk a little bit more about Vue as it was, a few years ago, you can hear me try to convince Wes that Vue is actually pretty good. So thank you, CJ, for an updated version of this. I really think it clears up a lot, and audience has been asking a lot for Vue content. Our potluck submissions have been saying, where's the Vue content? So now that we have you, CJ, I'm glad that we can bounce some of these things off of you and get a real good opinion here. So thank you so much for that.
Definitely. Happy to.
Yeah, let's get into the part of the show where we talk about sick picks and shameless plugs. Sick picks are things that we think are sick, things that we like, things that are cool, could be anything. I'm going to sick pick a potentially controversial shoe. And I say that because when my wife saw them, the first thing she said, these are at-home shoes, right? As in, you're not going to be wearing these shoes outdoors, because if you wear these shoes outdoors, you're going to be embarrassing me. It's essentially, I think, what she was trying to tell me. And I'll get these posted up here. What they are, you've all heard of Crocs. Crocs are ugly kind of foam shoes that are very comfortable. However, I didn't want to get Crocs, but I still wanted comfortable foam shoes. So I got the Jordan slides. They're called Jordan Roam, and they're essentially what if Nike made Jordan Crocs? They are very much Jordan Crocs. In fact, wearing them right now.
They look like were they called Yeezys? Like
they look like much less ugly Yeezys. The Yeezys kind of look like these got blown up in a weird kind of way. These look way more like normal shoes in some kind of way. Yeah.
Yeah, they look like a stylish Croc for sure.
And they weigh absolutely nothing. They're super cushy, super foamy. They're $60. So, you think Jordans, you're going to be spending $150. No, these are just like $60, nice and foam shoes. And for somebody whose office is just right down the street from their house here, I'm wearing them to the office every day here. And unfortunately, my wife will not allow me to wear them outside of the house in public. But, I can wear them at least into my office.
Nice. Cool. My sick pick has to do with charging devices. I'm going to grab it. So I don't know why I was so late to the game, but I was charging things with a bunch of charger blocks for the longest time. But just recently, I got a single unified interface with a bunch of USB charging ports and also power delivery ports. And it really cleaned up my desk. So this is my pick. I don't have a specific brand. If you just search for multi USB port on Amazon, you'll find something interesting. But yeah, this works. It cleans up my desk, and I don't know why I didn't get it sooner.
Yeah, that's a good sick pick. Anything to clean off your desk is something. I was just talking to you about this before the show started. It's Tuesday, and my desk has somehow in 2 days gotten completely covered with who knows what. So having less stuff on your desk is always a good thing. Cool. Well, Let's get into shameless plugs. I'm going to shamelessly plug. Actually, you know what? I'm going to shamelessly plug the Syntax GitHub. We kind of plug different things, and I've never plugged the GitHub. What's cool is that we have the website code. So if you're interested in seeing how we built the website, the code's on there. I've recently published a theme for Zed. I also have a theme for VS Code that I need to move into the Syntax repo or the Syntax organization. We have some really interesting stuff here. I'm working on a YouTube tools app that allows you to perform mass find and replace on YouTube videos from your own home here. Tools, we have our brand assets. We have a repo that's just all of our brand assets. Some really interesting stuff. So if you want to see some of the code we're working on over here at Syntax, check out the GitHub at github.com/orgs/syntaxfm. I'll post a link in the show notes.
Nice. And I'm just going to plug the website on that note because you may not realize it, but syntax.fm, you can listen to all of these episodes and search across them. So if I'm ever trying to find a specific topic like Vue or React and I want to see when it was covered, syntax.fm has got a really great built-in search engine. And Scott has been making updates to the site. So the built-in player works a little bit nicer. It keeps track of when and where you were watching and what episode you're on and stuff like that. Syntax.fm, check it out.
Yeah, the latest feature that is currently in a PR and it's only being blocked by one TypeScript error. It's one singular TypeScript error that I have to fix is adding play offline mode. In fact, we recorded an episode about how we built it, but it allows you to click save. And then what that does is it caches the MP3 to your computer. So that way, when you click play, it's not loading it from the network. Works on your phone, works on your desktop. You can cache a whole bunch of them, and eventually we'll be able to load up queuing like you have on an individual podcast player. So whenever you queue something, it'll automatically download it, so the next one plays. And you don't have to worry about network conditions and stuff like that. So a lot of updates, a lot of cool stuff coming, and we're just pushing code all the time to this thing. So check it out. And again, all this code is public, available to you if you want to see the code as well. Cool. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching or listening wherever you are at. If you want to watch this podcast, head on over to youtube.com/@syntaxfm. Either or. Thanks for joining us today. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.
Peace.